dollar continues to strengthen, though only fractionally. It closed in Toronto today at 96.91 cents U.S.
A dollar in the 1970s went much further than it does today. Gas, groceries, and movie tickets were affordable, and families could stretch a paycheck to cover daily needs. Those who lived through the decade remember exactly how far that dollar could go, filling pantries, paying rent, or taking a night out, before inflation reshaped the economy. In today's video, we're going back to the 1970s to break down what everyday life actually cost for the average American. Everyday prices, what goods actually cost. Exploring everyday prices in the 1970s offers a grounded view of what ordinary Americans spent on basic goods and services. A gallon of gasoline was about $0.35 in 1970, rising to roughly $0.86 by 1979 as energy markets tightened and inflation accelerated. At the grocery store, a half gallon of milk cost around $0.66, coffee about $0.91 a pound, and a pack of cigarettes averaged $0.48 in 1975. These figures indicate that many everyday items cost a fraction of what they do today in raw dollars. However, lower nominal prices did not mean these goods were universally cheap in the broader economic context. Inflation was a defining characteristic of the decade. Annual food price inflation averaged above 8%, and food inflation surpassed 10% in several years, including a 14.5% jump in 1973. These price movements reflect broader macroeconomic forces, especially global energy shocks and monetary trends, which made year-to-year comparisons more volatile than in later decades.
The world's largest economy, the United States, had witnessed its biggest gain in inflation in the last 30 years.
Though absolute cost figures appear low by today's standards, understanding them alongside wage and inflation data reveals a more complex picture of purchasing power during the period. Housing costs. Buying and renting in the 1970s, housing represents one of the largest components of household budgets. And in the 1970s, the landscape was markedly different from today. In 1970, the median value of owner-occupied homes was about $17,000. Rising throughout the decade as inflation pushed prices upward. While these numbers look low in nominal terms, they were consistent with typical household incomes of the time. The median household income was under $10,000 per year in the early 1970s. Rent also remained comparatively affordable. In 1975, average gross rent was far lower in nominal dollars than today's urban and suburban markets, and rent as a proportion of household income tended to consume a smaller share than it does in recent decades. Historical data from broader spending studies show that housing cost inflation, which includes rents, utilities, and furnishings, often exceeded 10% annually in this period, contributing to its growing share of consumer budgets. The relative ease of access to home ownership in the early portion of the decade was tied both to these pricing conditions and to broader economic structures, including different lending practices and wage relationships. By the late 1970s, persistent inflation and rising nominal prices began to challenge affordability, foreshadowing trends that would intensify in subsequent decades. Wages and incomes, earnings through the decade. Understanding wages and incomes in the 1970s is crucial to interpreting cost figures meaningfully. At the beginning of the decade, the federal minimum wage was $1.60 per hour, and typical wages were modest compared with today's figures, with the average hourly wage around $3.23 and median household incomes under $10,000 annually. Nominal wages did rise over the decade, but they often lagged behind inflation, particularly in key spending areas like food, housing, and transportation. When households faced rising prices without proportionally larger wage increases, the real purchasing power of earnings eroded, a defining economic challenge of the era. This dynamic is why many retrospective economic analyses note that people felt squeezed despite nominal improvements in earnings. A significant share of U.S. workers in the 1970s were employed in manufacturing and other sectors where union representation could help secure wage gains. But even here, rising living costs undercut some of those gains. Dual-income households were less common than they are today, meaning that many families were managing on a single main wage earner. This context makes clear that the interplay between prices and incomes defined much of the lived experience of the cost of living during the decade. Inflation and the dollar's value. What happened to your money? Inflation in the 1970s fundamentally reshaped how Americans experienced the cost of living. Unlike stable, predictable price increases, the decade saw persistent and often rapid inflation across major spending categories. Annual food price inflation averaged over 8%, with several years exceeding 10%, while housing costs, including rent and utilities, also rose sharply, sometimes above 10% per year. These trends reflected structural factors, from global energy shocks caused by the OPEC oil embargo to domestic monetary policy shifts, which pushed prices upward.
1973, when an OPEC oil embargo led to an international shortage and rocked the global economy.
As a result, the dollar bought significantly less over time, even as nominal wages rose. Economists note that income growth frequently lagged behind inflation, leaving many households with stagnant or declining real purchasing power. This combination of rising prices and slow economic growth, often called stagflation, created widespread financial strain, forcing families to carefully balance everyday expenses against limited earnings while navigating a volatile and uncertain economic environment. Transportation and mobility, cars, gas, and travel transportation in the 1970s was shaped by shifting consumer behavior and economic shocks. Owning a car was widespread. In 1970, 82.5% of U.S. households had at least one vehicle, though multi-car ownership was far less common than today. Classic American cars, like the Ford Pinto or Chevrolet Vega,
that was only ever made in America and Canada from 1971, so right at the beginning of that Ford Pinto era,
sold in the $2,300 to $4,600 range for new vehicles, a stark contrast to modern sticker prices. Meanwhile, gasoline started the decade at roughly $0.35 per gallon and climbed to about $0.86 per gallon by 1979 as oil price shocks reverberated through markets. The transportation sector experienced significant volatility as the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, embargoes, and subsequent global events drove fuel price inflation, which in turn affected consumer budgets and vehicle preferences. Transportation inflation during the decade frequently outpaced general price increases, reflecting higher costs for vehicles, fuel, and public transit. The cost of travel, such as domestic flights, was also considerably lower in nominal terms, but so were average incomes, making discretionary travel less accessible for many households. Overall, transportation expenses consumed a meaningful share of household budgets, intertwining with broader economic forces that influenced spending patterns throughout the decade. Education costs, college tuition and opportunity. The cost of higher education in the 1970s was modest relative to future decades, which made college attendance more affordable for many American families. For example, the average annual cost of tuition, fees, room, and board at a four-year public university was about $1,540 in 1971 and 72, a sum that could often be managed with summer work or family support without the heavy reliance on loans seen today. This relative affordability helped maintain broad access to higher education and supported upward mobility for segments of the population. In contrast to later periods, where tuition has grown substantially faster than wages, 1970s students generally faced lower sticker prices when entering college. However, rising inflation throughout the decade did push costs higher year by year, and families still faced trade-offs between education and other household expenses. The 1970s also saw social shifts in educational attainment. More women and members of underrepresented groups began attending post-secondary institutions as cultural and economic expectations of the labor market changed. While not free from financial strain, the cost of college in the 1970s was proportionately lower within the overall cost of living, enabling a larger share of young Americans to pursue degrees without the deep debt burdens familiar in later generations. Healthcare, costs, and spending patterns. Healthcare in the 1970s was a much smaller portion of overall household spending than it would become by the 21st century. In 1970, national healthcare expenditures totaled about $74.1 billion, and per-person spending averaged roughly $369, a figure that grew to roughly $997 per person by 1979. Out-of-pocket spending accounted for a significant share of these totals, but overall healthcare costs represented a smaller share of personal budgets compared with essentials like housing and food. Prescription prices were relatively low, averaging around $3.67 to $4.06 per prescription in 1970, and routine medical visits were modest in price by today's standards. Yet even in the 1970s, healthcare costs were rising faster than general price inflation, setting the stage for the dramatic increases seen in later decades.
America's government spending on healthcare, I've seen this chart before. It shows healthcare spending as a share of the economy of
Factors such as advancing medical technology, expanded insurance coverage, and an aging population would drive costs higher over time. Despite this, the overall burden of healthcare costs on families in the 1970s was considerably lighter than what many Americans experience today, with health expenditures rarely dominating household budgets as they often do now. The 1970s may feel distant, but understanding the decade's prices and wages reveals the roots of today's economic landscape. Every dollar, every purchase, and every paycheck from that era contributed to shaping consumer behavior, inflation trends, and household strategies that still echo now. The lessons of affordability, scarcity, and adaptation remain relevant. The story of living costs in the 1970s continues to inform how Americans think about money, work, and the economy. Stay tuned. The echoes of the past still shape how we spend, save, and plan today.